Thanks very much for attending, everybody. This talk is focused on a critical examination of influence in sport coaching. So it's built on some of my PhD work and also work post-PhD at the moment as well. The three key aims of the talk today really are to provide an overview and a critique of the dominant ways in which influence has been viewed in sport coaching to date. Secondly, to introduce some novel data and theoretical insights. And I'll introduce what I'll call different forms or types of influence in light of that data. And then thirdly, and most importantly, explore some potential implications or learning opportunities for coaches and coach educators as well. Just to provide some context behind the talk, in 2019, we did a systematic review looking at studies which were interested in coaching behaviours or coaching practice and relationships to athlete outcomes in some form. And what we found from this work was that the largest proportion of studies in this area had been cross-sectional or correlational in nature, a large body of work which was quantitative and often sought to measure or capture coaching behaviours using questionnaires, self-report mechanisms or observation tools, and then equally with athletes, giving them questionnaires to again isolate snapshots of outcomes and often correlate the two together. So what that told us, and it provides a really nice picture of the what, if you like, what elements of coaching practice are related to athlete outcomes, but perhaps less of a focus on the when, why, under which circumstances, and how those relationships are important for coaches and athletes in terms of influence. In terms of some of the conceptual or practical issues associated with that, if we take an everyday example of coaching, and if I reflect on my own practice as a coach, often what I would do before the PhD begun was to, if I'd seen an athlete who performed particularly well, I would praise that athlete with the intention of influencing them positively, perhaps not thinking as broadly about what the impact of that practice might be on other athletes in the session, or indeed what the unintended consequences of that practice might be. So with this one picture here, an example on the slide, is if this coach was praising one athlete here, for example, a number of different athletes in that session might not actually notice that practice is taking place for whatever reason, or they may be unintentionally influenced in some regard. So that was the real focus of this particular study, was to look at influence in a more complex and a more critical light. So I conducted a longitudinal study, which was an ethnography over an 11-month period with an under-17 representative level cricket squad. And that cricket squad was comprised of one head coach, one assistant coach, one team manager, and 22 athletes. And what I was interested in was exploring particular interactions between coaches and athletes, which either were influential or were deemed to be non-influential in some sense. The particular methods that I employed within the study were participant observation. So I spent time myself observing matches at all of the training sessions and took field notes at those games to note any particular interactions which I felt were influential or not. And indeed, I asked athletes and coaches to log such incidents with me as well. I video recorded all of the matches and training sessions where the coach wore a wireless microphone, so that you could hear the interactions which were taking place in that environment. I then used that footage in stimulated recall and semi-structured interviews with both coaches and athletes from the coach's perspective to understand what their intentions behind the influence was or were, and from the athlete's perspective, how they interpreted and made sense of those particular behaviours. So what I'm going to focus on now is, in terms of the analysis, there was a large number of incidents which were generated in light of the analysis. Today I'm going to focus on two in particular, and those are non-influence, where there is a discrepancy between the coach's intentions for influence. For whatever reason, the athletes might not have noticed the practice that had taken place. And secondly, unintended influence, where there was a gap between what the coach intended to do with their practice and the actual influence of that practice on one athlete, or indeed a number of athletes in the session itself. So start with non-influence initially. This is just a picture from one of the indoor sessions where the coach is at the far end of the hall here. The bowler, the spin bowler, is running in and bowls the ball, which hits the mat here on the floor at the top of the hall. The wicketkeeper takes a one-handed catch and stumps the batter out, which is deemed to be highly desirable performance in this particular context. The coach then praises the athlete, loudly and audibly claps, says well done to the specific player. And when I asked the coach what his intentions were behind this practice in an interview, he said that he does that like that because he wants to make a point of letting everybody know that it was good performance, so that it gives the player a kick because he said his name and then everybody can hear that. And that also he hoped that the player felt good because he was happy with what he'd done, but also happier with the fact that somebody had seen that and recognised it in front of the rest of the group. In actual fact, when I showed the same footage to the player in a stimulated recall interview, before I'd even had a chance to ask him a question, he said this: "Oh, I didn't even hear David, the head coach, say that. It was just the ringing in my ears and I was just caught up in the moment at the time." So for me, this was a really unexpected, but an interesting finding, in the sense that there was such a discrepancy between what the coach had intended for their influence and the actual way in which that practice had been interpreted and perceived by an athlete in this case. There was non-influence, if you like. Secondly is the example of unintended influence. And here the example comes from one of the outdoor fixtures where the team were playing an opposition county in a two-day match. And in this particular example, if we just go to the field notes, the score at the time was 64 for the loss of no wickets. John, who was one of the opening batters, played a loose shot and came close to losing his wicket. So the ball hit him on the pads and the opposition appealed to the umpire. The umpire decided that it wasn't out in the end. Sam, the assistant coach, reacted to that by breathing in sharply and audibly. Douglas, the team manager, said careful, where he was verbalising his thoughts, not really loud enough for the batters in the middle to hear, but perhaps loud enough for other individuals around him to hear. Sam then said to Douglas, "I'll tell you what it is, some umpires would have given that out just for the shot." And then he shouted on to the middle of the pitch to the batters to say, "Work hard, John, work hard." And interestingly, after that, John responded by playing more defensively. He went on to score 52 runs for the team. But again, more interestingly in this specific example was the intentions for the practice from the coach's point of view. When I was walking around the boundary with the coach later in the game, I asked him, what were you intending to do there with asking John to work hard? And he said it was to indicate that hopefully it would remind John to play more cautiously, to protect his wicket, if you like. And indeed, John, in one of the interviews, responded to that practice, saying that indeed it did allow him to think about getting his head back into the game, just to work hard, the fact that you've got to keep on grafting and not give your wicket away. So in some senses, it had the intentional influence from the coach's perspective. But actually, when I interviewed two of the other players who were sitting at the pavilion waiting to go into bat next and asked them about this practice, they said that they were also perhaps unintentionally influenced by this same practice. So although Sam, the coach, hadn't intended the influence to be on these two individuals, they both said that when they interpreted this practice, they said that when the coaches said that, they felt it was a silly shot. And when they went into bat, they shouldn't play like that. They shouldn't do anything stupid. They should just play straight and be careful. And from Roger's perspective, with Sam having a negative reaction to that play, he said he's thinking what not to do when he goes in. So when he gets in, it's helpful because it gives him almost a measure of how he needs to play and what the normative expectations of the coaches are in this particular sense. And for me, what these two examples refer to is this concept of noticing, which comes from education, from Mason. And Mason proposes that there are three levels or layers of noticing. The first of which, noticing, is what we interpret or experience in our day-to-day lives, the information that we pick up. The second of which is marking, and this is where we mark an event or an incident as being important or significant to perhaps then remark upon it at a later date. The final stage, recording, is then making a physical record, perhaps in a log or a diary, of those incidents for us to reflect upon at a later time. So for me, what this highlights is the fact that as coaches, perhaps we can pay attention to not only the intended influences of practice, but also the examples where our behaviours might be non-influential or indeed unintentionally influential on one individual or a number of other individuals. So just to close, some potential applied implications of the work, some questions to reflect upon or perhaps think about in practice, both when you are preparing, executing and reflecting on delivery. May well be useful is: who are you intended to influence, how and why? Who else might be unintentionally influenced by that specific practice? And also, how do you know if the intended influence matches or not the actual influence of the practice which has occurred? Thanks very much for listening, and more than happy to take any questions.
Perfect, thank you very much for that, Adam. Is there any questions from the floor? If anybody wants to jump on the mic, if they have something that they would like to ask. So I have a question. So is there anything that coaches can do to increase the effectiveness of their influence on athletes? Is there anything they can change in their behaviours to influence that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And one of the things which we thought carefully about from the work was, how can coaches use this? And a lot of, I suppose, what we're advocating is that coaches may not know if their practice has been influential unless you ask the athlete themselves. But equally, might doing so in a session, could that then degrade the authenticity of practice and you know, make athletes think, well, why are they asking if they've been influential? Why can't they just, you know, deliver behaviour? So I think perhaps having a coach or somebody else in that environment, it could be a researcher, could be a coach educator or coach developer, who is not an independent individual, but somebody who may be able to ask the athletes how they perceived or interpreted the practice, to then feed back into the coach, may be a useful strategy. For the example of the praise, which I referred to, where the athlete was unaware of it, perhaps praising the athlete in the moment, but then also praising them later on in the session to make sure that that practice has been influential. And I suppose reading, you know, as the coach, the player might well be smiling if they've done something well, but that's not to say that it was the coaching behaviour. It could just be the fact the athlete is reflecting on their own practice. So having a critical or a real sort of conceptual understanding of what influence is and how that might be different to our original intentions, perhaps.
Perfect. And maybe one more. Is there anything which influences how athletes perceive their coach's influence? Do you know what I mean? Is there any sort of individual differences which are important in that relationship?
Absolutely. I think a lot of what we saw from the data was that the power relationships, the dynamics between individuals, particularly in this context, a lot of athletes would refer more to the head coach than the assistant coach, because they saw his role as being more of a driver of the tactics, the information which they should look to take on. So there was one specific example where two conflicting pieces of information were given to the athletes, one by the head coach to play more attackingly, one by the assistant coach to play more defensively. So that was really interesting in the sense that different athletes use their agency, use their reflexivity to align their own playing interests with either that of the head coach or the assistant coach, based upon those power dynamics or based upon their own individual strengths, how they sought, you know, whether they saw themselves as more attacking players or defensive players. So I think definitely the power dynamics is a critical factor in understanding the influence and how individuals perceive that influence. Yeah.